Route 61 runs south through the anthracite coal country of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, through towns that have names like Ashland and Mount Carmel and Shamokin, towns that exist because coal existed beneath them, towns that absorbed a century of extraction and survived it in the ordinary way. Route 61 passes through most of them without incident. It does not pass through Centralia. Centralia is where Route 61 stops being a road. You can find the place where it stops. The old alignment is still present, which is not the same as still being there as a functional surface. The asphalt is cracked in a way that asphalt does not normally crack, in long lateral fractures that run perpendicular to the direction of travel, as though the ground beneath has been exhaling, pressing up from below, breathing out through stone. The cracks are wide enough to see into. Some of them vent steam. In January, when the Pennsylvania air is cold enough that your breath shows, the steam from the cracks in the old highway is visible from 50 yards away. Pale wisps rising from a road that goes nowhere, in a valley where the hills are forested and everything appears, at first glance, to be ordinary. The ground is warm. You notice this if you crouch down and press your palm to the asphalt, or simply stand still long enough on a cold day, and realize your feet are not as cold as they should be. The warmth rises from below, from somewhere beneath the road, beneath the hillside, beneath the old borough of Centralia, which was once a town of 1,200 people, and is now a grid of streets that lead to empty lots where houses used to stand. The warmth has a source. The source is a coal mine fire that started in May of 1962 and has not stopped burning since. It is burning right now, at temperatures that can exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the seams where the coal is most concentrated. A fire that has consumed roughly 400 acres of underground coal in 63 years and is projected to continue burning for another 250 years. You are standing on top of a fire that started in 1962 and will burn for another 250 years. Beneath your feet, coal is burning at 1,000 degrees. The town that was here is mostly gone. The fire is not. The old road they call Graffiti Highway, the abandoned stretch of Route 61 that was, for decades, a peculiar tourist attraction, its cracked and heaving surface covered in spray-painted messages and declarations from visitors who came to witness something that was hard to categorize, something between a disaster and a monument, was covered with fill dirt in 2020. The state brought in equipment and buried it, not to address the fire, which continues unaffected by what happens at the surface, but to discourage the visitors, whose presence had become a liability. The fire didn't notice. The fire has never noticed anything done at the surface. The fire proceeds at its own pace, which is approximately 75 feet per year through the underground mine network, a pace so slow that it is almost impossible to perceive, and so steady that, over the course of decades, it becomes catastrophic. There are fewer than 5 people living in Centralia today. The United States Postal Service revoked the town's zip code, 17927, in 2002, which is an administrative way of saying that an incorporated borough of Pennsylvania had been reduced by a fire and by the government's relationship with that fire to something that no longer required its own postal designation. The street grid is still there. The fire hydrants are still there, red and yellow, standing at corners where houses no longer stand, connected to water mains that serve no addresses. The street signs are there: Locust Avenue, Park Street, Wood Street. The signs point down roads that go to empty grass and foundation outlines and the occasional stretch of cracked pavement that has not yet been removed. The fire is still there. This is the story of how a town becomes nothing. It takes a long time. It takes the right combination of poverty and bureaucratic patience, and a government's quiet assessment that the people involved are not worth the cost of saving. It takes a fire that moves at 75 feet per year, slow enough that you can always tell yourself it will be someone else's problem after the next study, after the next report. It takes 63 years. It is still not finished. Centralia in the spring of 1962 is a working town, organized around work that is no longer available in quite the quantities it once was, but has been available long enough to leave its marks. The sturdy row houses on the numbered streets, the churches on the hillsides, the Legion Hall, the stores on Locust Avenue. The population is around 1,000 people. Most families have been there for generations, arrived when the anthracite coal arrived, and stayed, because communities, once built, acquire their own inertia. Ferris Gallagher's grandfather worked the Buck Mountain Seam, the vast anthracite deposit that runs beneath this part of Schuylkill County in a great tilted layer of compressed ancient carbon. His grandfather came from County Clare in 1908, when the mines were hiring, and worked them for 30 years, and his son worked them until they closed. And by the spring of 1962, the mines are largely abandoned. The coal companies extracted what was economical and left the rest, left the tunnels and galleries and worked out chambers that honeycomb the rock beneath Centralia's streets. Ferris works at a hardware store in Ashland now. His house on Locust Avenue is 40 years old and solid, and Donna has flowers along the front walk she has been tending for 20 years. On May 27, 1962, the Centralia Borough Council authorized a controlled burn at the town's landfill, an open pit at the edge of town, an old strip mine working used for waste disposal, a practice common to small Pennsylvania towns. The fire was meant to reduce accumulated trash. What the people who authorized the burn didn't account for was that the pit sat at the edge of an exposed vein of coal, and that the coal vein connected underground to the abandoned mine workings beneath Centralia. The fire found the coal vein the way fire finds fuel. The fire moved from the burning trash to the exposed seam. From the seam, it moved into the tunnels. The first efforts to extinguish it were made later that summer and into the fall. Water was pumped in. Trenches were dug. The approaches used were the approaches available. Local equipment, limited funds, the assumption that a mine fire, even one that had gotten a start, could be contained with the tools at hand. The tools at hand were not adequate. The fire had already penetrated the mine network more deeply than the surface interventions could reach, had already found the geometry of those old tunnels, the angles and elevations that allowed it to move and breathe and find new coal in the dark. The state was asked for help. The federal government was asked for help. The estimated cost to extinguish the fire in 1962, before it had moved significantly through the underground network, before it had the decades of spread that would make later intervention geometrically more complicated, was $175,000. $175,000 in 1962 to put out a fire under a town of 1,000 people. The federal government spent more than that on a single highway rest stop. The fire is still burning. The borough of Centralia could not afford $175,000. It was a small town with a small budget and a tax base organized around an industry that was already in decline. The state reviewed the request and declined to fund the extinguishment. The Federal Office of Surface Mining, which would later spend decades and hundreds of millions of dollars on Centralia and still not extinguish the fire, determined that the situation did not meet the threshold for federal intervention. The money was not spent. The fire was not put out. The landfill pit was fenced. Reports were written. The file was opened, and the file grew, and the fire moved underground at approximately 75 feet per year, and Centralia's 1,000 people went about their lives in the way that people go about their lives when they do not know that the ground beneath them is burning. What is a report for? That is worth sitting with. Garland Bast sat with it often enough. Garland Bast is a state mine inspector, assigned to the Centralia file in the late 1960s, a careful man who writes careful reports in the careful language of government documentation, who measures the fire's advance by drilling boreholes and taking temperature readings and comparing the current data to the previous data, and noting the progression in the tables and appendices of documents that go to Harrisburg and are reviewed and acknowledged and filed. He is not a dramatic man. He does not write dramatic reports. He writes factual reports, and the facts compiled over the years he spends on this file tell a consistent story. The fire is advancing. The fire is approaching residential areas. The fire is producing carbon monoxide and other gases that are entering basements and crawl spaces. The fire requires intervention. The fire requires intervention now. The fire required intervention several years ago. The reports are filed. Nothing happens. The fire continues at 75 feet per year. Garland drives out to Centralia in the autumn of 1968 to take new borehole readings. He parks on Wood Street and walks to the drilling sites, does the measurements, writes the numbers in his field notebook, then sits in his car before driving back. The numbers are worse than the last set. They are always worse than the last set. He has written, in his most recent report, that the fire's current trajectory will bring it beneath the residential sections within a decade, if unchecked. The report is sitting in a file drawer in Harrisburg. Garland drives home. In the house on Locust Avenue, Ferris Gallagher notices that his basement is warmer than it used to be. He notices this in the way that people notice things that develop gradually. As an impression first, a sense that something is slightly different. Not wrong exactly, not alarming exactly. Just different in the particular way that a thing is different when it has been changing for months, and you have not been looking at it directly. He mentions it to Donna one evening in November. She says she has noticed it too. They discuss whether it might be the furnace, whether something is different about how the house is holding heat this year, whether the winter is just different. The furnace is fine. The house has not changed. It is November, and the basement is warm in a way that basements in November in Pennsylvania are not supposed to be warm. Donna Gallagher is not someone who ignores things. She is the kind of person who sees what is in front of her and says what she sees, and what she sees, beginning in that autumn of 1968 and continuing into the years that follow, is a house that is changing in ways she cannot account for by ordinary explanation. The basement is warm. The tomatoes she planted along the south fence die in a summer when the neighbors' gardens are producing well, and when she digs up the roots, she finds them blackened in a way she has not seen before, and the soil in that part of the yard is noticeably warm to the touch. She mentions both of these things to Ferris. Ferris, who grew up in this town, whose grandfather is buried in the cemetery on the hill, whose father worked the seam beneath them, who has lived his entire life in a place that is, to him, simply where life happens. Ferris tells her that it will be fine, that the state is looking into it, that there are reports being done, that they will figure it out. He believes this. It is worth saying that he believes this, because the alternative, the thing that Donna is beginning to understand without quite articulating, is that the ground beneath their house is burning, and has been burning, and is not going to stop, and that no one with the authority to stop it has made the decision to spend what stopping it would cost. The alternative is that they are living above a fire, and the fire is winning, and nothing is going to happen about it. Ferris cannot accept that. He has been in Centralia his whole life. His grandfather helped build the house on Locust Avenue. He cannot accept that Centralia is the kind of place that gets abandoned. This is the pure math of Centralia, and it is worth stating it as plainly as it can be stated. $175,000 in 1962 was the price of extinguishment. $42 million in 1984 was the price of relocation, of moving the people out, because the fire had been allowed to spread until the fire was irreversible. More than $100 million in total government expenditure on Centralia has been spent, and the fire is still burning. The cheapest option was always the first one. It was also the only one that would have worked. The years between 1962 and 1979 are, in the history of Centralia, a study in what happens when a known problem is managed rather than solved. The fire is not a secret. It is in the reports. Garland Bast's files document its progress with the precision of a slow natural disaster being observed by people without the authority to stop it. The residents of Centralia are not unaware that there is a fire under their town. They are told, repeatedly, and by various official and semi-official sources, that the situation is being monitored, that efforts are ongoing, that the appropriate agencies are engaged with the problem. The situation is being monitored in the same way that a patient's vital signs are monitored when the treatment option has not been authorized. The readings are taken, the data is recorded, the deterioration proceeds. By the early 1970s, the ground temperature in parts of Centralia has risen enough to be noticeable to anyone paying attention. There are places in the town where the snow melts faster than it should, on certain sections of sidewalk, in certain yards, along certain stretches of road where the underground heat conducts up through the rock and soil to the surface and radiates upward into the winter air. There are places where the grass greens early in spring and dies early in summer, where the soil temperature is simply too high for roots to survive, where the topography of a garden or a lawn has become a map of the fire below. Donna Gallagher notices all of this. She notices the crack that appears in the east wall of the basement in the winter of 1972 and widens over the following 2 years. She notices the smell, a faint sulfur smell in the basement on certain days, gone on others, never strong enough to be an emergency, but always present enough to be a reminder. She tells Ferris she wants to move. Ferris says they cannot move. He means partly that they cannot afford to. The house on Locust Avenue is their primary asset, and he suspects it is worth less every year. He means partly that moving is an admission that Centralia is finished, and he is not prepared to make that admission. He means partly that someone with the power to stop this will stop it. He means all of these things, and none of them constitutes an answer to the crack in the basement wall, or the sulfur smell, or the dead tomatoes. The state does not act. The federal government does not act. Garland Bast writes more reports. The fire moves at 75 feet per year. In 1969, John Coddington, who owns the service station on the main road through Centralia, checks the temperature of the gasoline in his underground storage tanks and finds it reading at 172 degrees Fahrenheit. Gasoline in underground tanks normally reads around 60 degrees, slightly above ground temperature, insulated from seasonal variation. 172 degrees is the temperature of gasoline sitting above a coal fire, burning 30 or 40 feet down. Coddington reports this to state officials. State officials note the report. In 1979, Coddington checks his tanks again. The gasoline reads 128 degrees. The fire has moved into different tunnels, closer to different properties, and the heat at his tank reflects a position now slightly behind the advancing front. The fire has passed beneath him and moved on. The pattern of those years, from 1962 through the late 1970s, is a pattern Centralia shares with other American disasters. Disasters that befell communities that were poor, working class, not located in places with political weight. The pattern is study without action, reports without response, a community slowly endangered while the agencies responsible produced documentation of the danger without producing the intervention that would have stopped it. There is a pattern here worth naming. Decades later, the residents of Flint, Michigan would sit in public meetings with brown water in bottles and be told their water was safe, that the appropriate agencies were engaged. Different hazard, identical structure. A community without political capital, a known danger, reports that documented the problem without producing the intervention that would address it. Poor communities in America have a particular relationship with their governments, and that relationship includes, as one of its recurring features, the experience of being studied while being harmed. Centralia is one version of this. It is not the only version. Donna Gallagher has headaches. They began around 1974. Not dramatic, just a persistent low-grade pressure behind her eyes that is present most mornings and fades by midday, when she has been out of the house for a while. She has seen the doctor in Ashland twice. He prescribed aspirin. She told him about the basement and the smell and the warm floor. He sent her home with aspirin again and a suggestion to sleep with the bedroom window open. She sleeps with the window open. In January. In Pennsylvania. The headaches are still there. They are better when she is not in the house. She understands what this means before she is willing to say it. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless and produced by incomplete combustion, by coal burning in limited oxygen, which is precisely what is happening in the mine workings beneath Centralia. It seeps upward through cracks in the rock, entering basements through foundations and floor joints, concentrating in spaces with limited ventilation. At low concentrations, it produces headaches. At moderate concentrations, it produces nausea, dizziness, confusion. At high concentrations, it produces unconsciousness and death. The residents of Centralia are, through the 1970s, living with concentrations that range from the headache-producing to something worse, depending on where in the borough they live and how close to the fire's advancing front. Some families install carbon monoxide detectors, the new devices becoming available in the late 1970s. The detectors sound alarms. The windows go up. The alarms stop. The windows go down. The cycle repeats. Some families sleep with the windows open permanently. Some families, in houses where the CO levels are lower, live with headaches and nausea and dizziness and tell themselves it is other things. The coal dust, the flu season, the stress of wondering about the fire, the 1,000 ordinary explanations available to a person who does not want to believe that their home is killing them. Slowly. Midge Koshoff lives 3 blocks from the Gallaghers on Park Street, in a house she has occupied for 50 years. A house she moved into as a young married woman, and has lived in through a marriage. A widowing. A long subsequent solitude, that is not loneliness exactly, but the particular quality of a life whose structure has been set by one place for so long that the place and the life are indistinguishable. She is 71 years old in 1979 and was born in Centralia and has never lived anywhere else and is not planning to start. The CO monitor in her kitchen goes off occasionally. She opens the kitchen window. She has told the state inspector who came to her door in 1978 that she is not interested in relocation options. The inspector left her a pamphlet. The pamphlet is in a kitchen drawer under some rubber bands. Midge knows the fire is there. She has known it for years. The warm section of her backyard, where nothing grows anymore, has been warm since the mid-1970s. She does not deny the fire the way Ferris denies it. She is a more clear-eyed person than Ferris, more willing to look at a thing and call it what it is. What she has decided, which is different from denial, is that the fire is not going to determine where she lives. She was born in Centralia. She will die in Centralia. The fire will have to work around her. Garland Bast drives out to Centralia in the spring of 1979 for his quarterly site assessment. He takes borehole readings at the established monitoring points. He records temperatures. He notes the fire's advance since the previous quarter and calculates its projected position relative to the residential street grid. His field notebook for this visit contains a notation, in his precise, unadorned handwriting, that the fire has now reached a position where it underlies several streets in the eastern residential section of the borough, and that ground temperatures at surface level in certain locations are elevated significantly above ambient. He drives back to his office. He writes his report. The report says what his reports have been saying for a decade, which is that the fire is advancing toward the populated areas, and that the situation requires intervention. The report is filed. What is a report for? On February 14th, 1981, a Saturday, the kind of cold, clear Pennsylvania winter morning when the air is dry and the sky is pale and the ground is frozen hard. Todd Domboski, who is 12 years old is in his grandmother's backyard on Locust Avenue, a few houses down from the Gallaghers. What he's doing in the backyard is the ordinary business of being 12 years old on a cold Saturday. Playing, exploring, occupying space the way children occupy space in places they know well, without particular purpose and without particular caution. He is walking across ground he has walked across dozens of times. The ground opens. The sinkhole is 4 feet across. It drops 150 feet into a burning mine cavity. The temperature at the bottom is measured later at above 300 degrees Fahrenheit. The carbon monoxide concentration in the sinkhole is measured at several hundred parts per million, a concentration that would cause unconsciousness within minutes and death within an hour in an adult, faster in a child. Todd Domboski grabs a tree root at the edge of the hole as the ground gives way beneath him. His cousin, who is with him, pulls him out. The hole is 4 feet across. It is 150 feet deep. It is full of carbon monoxide. It is on fire at the bottom. There is nothing more to say about that hole. The numbers are the horror. The geometry is the horror. A child is alive because of a tree root. The sinkhole at Todd Domboski's grandmother's backyard became national news the following week. The wire services ran the story. Congressional offices received constituent calls. State officials who had been managing the Centralia situation for nearly 2 decades suddenly found themselves discussing it in terms that were harder to manage than reports and assessments, in terms of a child who almost fell into a burning hole in his grandmother's backyard, in terms of what had been known and for how long, and why nothing had been done. David Decock, a journalist who had been covering Centralia for years and would go on to write the definitive account of the borough's story, was among the reporters who saw in the Domboski incident what it actually was. Not the beginning of the crisis, which had begun in 1962, but the moment when the slow catastrophe became impossible to keep out of the national conversation. The human story had been there all along. The Gallaghers and the other families who had been living above the fire for 19 years had been the human story all along. It did not require a sinkhole to exist. It required a sinkhole to be recognized. One resident testified to a congressional subcommittee in 1981 about the years before the national attention, the headaches, the warm basement floor she had reported to state officials, the cycle of assurances that the situation was being assessed. She described what it felt like to have a warm basement and dead plants and recurrent headaches, and to be told, by people with authority, that everything was being handled. Her words were not delivered in anger. They were delivered in the voice of someone who has been patient for a long time and has run out of patience and is now simply stating, for the record, what the years were like. In 1981, following the Domboski sinkhole and the congressional attention it generated, the Office of Surface Mining began a comprehensive assessment of the fire's extent. The assessment concluded, as Garland Bast's reports had been concluding for a decade, that the fire was advancing and that intervention was necessary. It also concluded that complete extinguishment was no longer feasible at any cost that could be justified. The fire had spread through too much of the underground network to be addressed by surface intervention. The window for extinguishment had closed. The fictional town of Silent Hill sits in perpetual fog and ash, a former resort town consumed by an underground fire that opened doors to other dimensions, that transformed the ordinary into the monstrous. Millions of people know Silent Hill. The game designers drew their inspiration from the photographs and accounts of Centralia, took the specific geography of this real place, and amplified it into something that felt like metaphor, but was rooted in fact. The fictional town got a movie. The real town got a revoked zip code. The real version does not have fog or sirens or creatures from other dimensions. The real version has a warm road and a sulfur smell, and a CO monitor going off in a kitchen, and a child grabbing a tree root. It has Donna Gallagher waking up with a headache in January, with her window open, because the air outside is safer than the air inside her own home. It has Garland Bast sitting in his car on Wood Street in 1968, looking at his field notebook, knowing what the numbers mean, driving home. The real version is ongoing. In 1983, the Office of Surface Mining made available $42,000 per household for voluntary relocation. The offer was presented not as the acknowledgement of a government failure to act when action was possible, but as a solution, a path forward. The framing irritated people like Donna Gallagher, who had been asking for something to be done for years, who had been told for years that something was being done, and who were now being offered money to leave as though leaving were the solution all along. Most families took the offer. There was no moral failure in that. The offer was real money for a family in Centralia, and the alternative was staying in a house above a coal mine fire with no assurance anything would change. The families who took the money and left were not giving up. They were making the rational decision that the irrational situation had been building toward for 20 years. They loaded their furniture and their photographs and drove away from Centralia, and behind them, the houses began to come down. The demolitions were methodical. House by house, block by block, the row houses and split levels and older doubles were removed. Not burned. Burning things near an underground coal fire seemed unwise. Demolished. Knocked down, and the debris removed and the lots left as grass or bare earth. And gradually the street grid began to look less like streets between buildings and more like streets between absences. A map of where things had been. Ferris Gallagher took the offer in 1984 after a conversation with Donna that was not a single conversation, but the final form of a 15-year argument. Ferris saying it would be fine. Donna saying she needed to leave, neither of them moving. In 1984, Donna stopped saying she needed to leave and started saying she was going to leave, with or without him. They left together. He drove the moving truck out of Centralia on a Tuesday morning in October, past the fire hydrants on the empty corners, past the lots where neighbors' houses had come down, past the stretch of road near the old landfill where steam rose from the cracks. He did not look back at the house on Locust Avenue. They drove to Ashland and started the process of being from somewhere that was being erased. Midge Koshoff didn't take the offer. She was 76 years old in 1984 and had been in Centralia her entire life and was not going to leave because the government offered her money to do so. Her position was not irrational. She understood the fire was real, that it was not going to be extinguished. She had reached a conclusion that was, in its own way, perfectly logical. If Centralia was going to burn regardless, she would burn in it. The state offered more money. She declined. A state official came to her door in 1985 with a more substantial package, and she told him, with the courtesy of someone who has nothing left to be polite about except her manners, that she appreciated the visit and was not interested. She had CO monitors in the kitchen and bedroom. She opened windows when they went off. In 1992, Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain over all remaining Centralia properties. The legal authority was clear enough. The state could take the land, but the application of it to people who had lived in their homes for decades, who had fought through the courts for the right to remain, produced a series of legal challenges that kept the situation active for years. The holdouts fought not because they did not understand the danger, but because they were being asked to surrender a place that constituted the physical record of their entire lives, and the surrender was being demanded by the same government that had refused to spend $175,000 in 1962. The courts produced a settlement in 2013. The remaining residents were permitted to stay until their deaths, after which their properties would revert to the Commonwealth. It was a settlement designed for people who were going to die there. Which is to say, it was designed for Midge Koshoff, who received the news of it with the same expression she had received every other piece of Centralia news for 30 years. A nod, a brief acknowledgement, a return to whatever she had been doing. The U.S. Postal Service revoked Centralia's zip code, 17927, in 2002. The fire was not notified. It continued without a mailing address. The fire's progress since 2002 has been monitored by the USGS and state environmental agencies, and the monitoring produces data consistent with what Garland Bast was producing in the 1970s. The fire is advancing. It is advancing at approximately 75 feet per year. It has consumed roughly 400 acres of underground coal. The projections suggest it will continue burning for at least 250 more years, possibly significantly longer. There is no plan to extinguish it. The agencies that monitor the fire state that extinguishment is economically infeasible. The cost of reaching and smothering a fire, spread through this extent of underground workings, would exceed any reasonable calculation of benefit. This is technically accurate. It is also a description of the outcome of a decision made in 1962. The cheapest option is almost always the first one, and the first option closes as the problem grows, and the problem grows at 75 feet per year. The old Route 61, the graffiti highway, was covered with fill dirt in April of 2020 to discourage visitors whose presence had become a liability. The fire did not notice. Below the fill, the cracks are still there. Below the cracks, the fire is still there. The fire does not care about surface interventions. There are fewer than 5 people living in Centralia today. The exact number changes because the people who remain are old, and when they die, their properties revert to the state, and the state does not put new residents in them. The street grid is still maintained. The roads are there. The fire hydrants are there, painted and functional and connected to mains that serve no addresses. You can drive down Locust Avenue and count the lots where houses stood, see the faint outlines of foundations in the grass. You can find the section of road near the old landfill where the ground vents steam on cold days. You can find the hillside where the cemetery is, where the dead of Centralia remain in the one part of the borough that has not been formally vacated. Because you cannot relocate a cemetery, because the dead do not respond to relocation offers. The fire is advancing beneath the cemetery. Boreholes drilled on the cemetery's perimeter in recent years show elevated temperatures consistent with the fire's approach. The headstones are intact. The fire moves at 75 feet per year. The monitoring continues. The data accumulates. The fire advances. The reports that described its progress before anyone in authority was willing to act are in archives now, the documents yellowing in the way that documents yellow when the problem they described was not solved. Garland Bast retired in 1981. He said years later that Centralia was the hardest assignment of his career, not because of technical complexity, but because of what the work required him to witness. He wrote the reports. He filed the reports. The reports did not save Centralia. Route 61 now curves around the void where the old alignment used to be. A new section of road, built when the original buckled and cracked from the underground heat, rerouted because the ground it had been built on was no longer stable enough to support it. The rerouted road passes the edge of what was Centralia without passing through it. There is a sign for the borough at the turnoff. The sign points down a road that leads to empty streets and fire hydrants, and the faint outlines of foundations and steam rising from cracks in the earth. In the silent winters, when the Pennsylvania sky is the particular gray of February and the air is cold and still and the hills around Centralia are bare-branched against the pale sky, the steam from the ground vents is visible from a distance. It rises slowly, without drama, from the surface of the earth, from the cracks in what remains of the old roads, from the hillsides above the former residential sections, from the ground of the former borough of Centralia, Pennsylvania, which was incorporated in 1866 and had its postal designation revoked in 2002, and has fewer than 5 residents and a coal mine fire beneath it that will burn until approximately the year 2276. The steam rises. The ground is warm. The fire proceeds through the underground workings at its steady pace, through the Buck Mountain seam, through the abandoned galleries and drifts and headings of the old mine network, through the darkness beneath the former streets of a town that trusted that someone with the authority to act would eventually act. Through the dark, at 75 feet per year, through coal that was laid down 300 million years ago and was mined for a century, and is now burning in the absence of the town that the mining built, in the absence of the people who built the town, in the absence of everyone who was here and is gone. The fire is burning. It will burn for 250 more years. Nobody is going to put it out. The decision was made in 1962, when $175,000 was too much to spend on a small town in Pennsylvania. Everything since then has been the cost of that decision, compounding at 75 feet per year, underground, in the dark, where nobody has to watch it.